Hello, and thank you for visiting this video blog. Today I will be speaking and sharing with you the research process and research conclusions, research questions about a very interesting topic, the progress, national identity, and the Union of 1707, a British story of human thought. So, my name is Erwin Escobar. I'm a high school history teacher. I'm also an adjunct professor at a couple of universities. And I decided to work on the intellectual movements that came as a result of the Act of Union between Scotland and England in 1707. I am passionate about the academic study of intellectual history and cannot think of a better era in modern history to dive into the analysis of important ideas that have shaped the world into what it is today. Just to name a few, I can think of Adam Smith and his book on the wealth of nations. I can think of many others, Adam Ferguson and many others that, thinkers that came as a result or that became very influential during this era and continue to impact the world with their ideas today. So the key research questions were the following. This research project was about shedding light on the literary revival movement and its socio-political and artistic efforts to counter the potential loss of Scottish cultural identity due to the rise of Englishness in the years that followed the Union of 1707. This project was developed with the purpose of answering the following research questions. What were the socio-political effects of the indigenous literary revival movement in 18th century Scotland, and how did this impact the rise of Englishness? Obviously, when England and Scotland came together in 1707, there were different socio-political reactions to that process. Now, the main thing here is that for the most part, the historiography of the topic focuses on the study of the Scottish Enlightenment as the only predominant intellectual movement of this era. Like I said before, my purpose with this project is to shed light on a different or on a parallel intellectual movement that developed as a result, as a direct consequence, as a response to the Union of 1707. So among the research questions are: what was the response from England to the indigenous literary revival movement? What are the differences and similarities between the Scottish Enlightenment and the literary revival movement? Was the indigenous literary movement an attempt to mobilize Scots to resist the Union in 1707, pretty much the political implications, and also what was the response from England to the indigenous literary revival? Also, what were the socio-political outcomes of the indigenous literary revival in post-Union Scotland? Again, these are broad questions, these are big questions, and it's a good number of questions that allowed me to really look into the topic closely. The major types of evidence, like I said, this project was an inquiry into the intellectual movements of 18th century Scotland. The essay is really about the core tendencies of both intellectual movements, and the Scottish Enlightenment and the literary revival. Now, the historiography of the topic clearly emphasized the impact of the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment in Britain and the rest of the world, but it merely acknowledges the existence of the indigenous literary revival movement. So this essay is about giving really a voice to the authors and publishers of the indigenous literary movement, of the indigenous literary revival movement of the 18th century in Scotland. The primary and secondary sources were available online for the most part. I was able to delve into the writings of many of the Scottish authors and publishers of the era, particularly one very important character, and I was able to read his work, was Alan Ramsay. He was a very, very influential figure of the time period, representing the Scottish literary revival, the indigenous literary revival. So his impact, the impact of his writings, of his poems, of what he tried to accomplish, was widely acknowledged in Scotland throughout the 18th century, all the way to the end, really, of the 19th century, when we still have magazines and newspapers and periodicals acknowledging his work and praising his work and talking about the impact of his work on the English language, on Scottish culture, on the preservation of Scottish identity, of Scottish cultural identity during this age of the transition to the Union that obviously started on May 1st, 1707. Finally, my conclusions were that the current historical narrative, as I said, represents the idea that the only significant intellectual movement of the era was the Scottish Enlightenment. However, there is a problem with this interpretation, as it leaves out the significant role of the Indigenous Literary Revival. The Indigenous Literary Revival had opposing goals to that of the Enlightenment and represented an opposing intellectual force to the cultural transformation of Scotland after the Union of 1707. While the authors of the Scottish Enlightenment pushed for cultural assimilation as the only way to move towards progress, the authors and publishers of the Indigenous Literary Revival contended that although the Union provided economic benefits to the Scots, it was all at the cost of their liberty and cultural identity. Although the Indigenous Literary Revival had a significant sociocultural impact that lasted well into the 19th century, it did not deter the inevitable political processes that came as a direct consequence of the Act of Union signed on May 1st, 1707. Thank you for watching.